I know something about you that you don't know about yourself. You are already being calculated? Now wait, don't get up, don't reach for your phone. I know, everybody says that. Every philosopher from Socrates to the guy who sells incense outside the train station says you are going to die. It's practically a greeting card at this point. And you hear it, you nod, you think, yes, mortality, very profound. Now what's for lunch? But that's not what I said. I didn't say you are mortal. I said you are going to die. There's a difference, and that difference is what I want to talk to you about today. Because I'm not speaking philosophically, I'm speaking mathematically. And that is a much scarier thing to say, because what I mean is this: there is a number, a real number, a calculated, derivable, specific number that describes the probability that you will die before your next birthday. And it's been sitting in a mathematical equation written down in ink for almost 200 years, and almost nobody talks about it. Not at dinner parties, not in schools, not even in most biology classes. It hides there in actuarial tables and insurance spreadsheets in the back rooms of life insurance companies, doing its quiet, merciless work. The equation is called the Gompertz law of human mortality. And once you understand it, really understand it, in the way I'm going to show you today, you will never look at your own body the same way again. He picks up a piece of chalk, looks at it, sets it back down. Now let me tell you something. I've spent my life working with equations. I've stared into the mathematics of quantum electrodynamics, the wobble of spinning electrons, the absurdity of particles that are in two places at once. And some equations are beautiful, some are useful, some are terrifying. This one is all three. It's beautiful in the way a scalpel is beautiful, precise, cold, indifferent to your feelings. It's useful in the way a death sentence is useful. It tells you exactly what you need to know, whether you want to hear it or not. And it's terrifying for a reason I'll get to later, a reason that goes much, much deeper than the numbers themselves. But first, let me tell you about the man who discovered it. Because you don't understand an equation until you understand the man who first stared into that particular darkness and decided to write it down. The year is 1825. London. Fog everywhere. Naturally, London in 1825 had fog like it was a personality trait. Coal smoke and river damp and the particular gray of a city that has decided collectively not to be cheerful about anything. Into this fog, a man named Benjamin Gompertz is sitting at a desk. He's a mathematician. He works for an insurance company, which in 1825 is a bit like being a wizard who works for a bank, slightly unusual, slightly suspicious, very quietly important. His job is to figure out how much to charge people for life insurance. To do that, he needs to figure out something that nobody in the entire history of human civilization had managed to figure out rigorously. How does the probability of dying change as you age? Now, people had noticed things. People had tables of deaths. London kept records of who died and when, partly for practical reasons and partly because the English have always had a slightly morbid interest in cataloging their own decline. You could see, if you looked at the tables, that old people died more than young people, that 30-year-olds died more than 20-year-olds. That 60-year-olds died at an absolutely alarming rate compared to anyone under 40. But nobody had found the pattern, the underlying rule, the mathematics hiding inside the madness of human mortality. Gompertz looked at those tables. He stared at them the way I stare at a physics problem, which is to say, he didn't look for the answer. He looked for the shape. He asked himself, what kind of curve is this? Because every relationship between numbers has a shape, and if you can identify the shape, you can write down the equation, and if you can write down the equation, you own the thing. You understand it. It belongs to you. And what he found, what he discovered sitting at that fog-damp desk in 1825 was so clean, so precise, so almost insultingly simple that it must have felt like a magic trick. The probability of dying, he found, doesn't just increase with age. It doesn't increase linearly. It doesn't just tick up by a fixed amount every year like a meter running. No, it increases exponentially. It doubles. Roughly every 8 years of your life, your probability of dying in the next year doubles. Every 8 years. When you are 10 years old, the chance that you will die before you turn 11 is very, very small. Let's say it's approximately 0.03%, 3 in 10,000. Tiny, almost negligible. When you are 18, it's slightly higher. When you are 26, it's doubled again. When you are 34, doubled again. When you are 42, doubled again. And on it goes, relentlessly, mechanically, without mercy or exception, doubling, 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 until by the time you are 80 years old, the probability that you will die in the next 12 months is somewhere between 10% and 15%, not negligible, not distant, real. And by 90%, you're looking at roughly 25 to 30% per year. By 100, if you make it, you're over 40%. The curve doesn't stop. There is no wall where it suddenly levels off and says, okay, that's enough, you can relax now. It just keeps climbing, exponentially, remorselessly, as if the universe set a timer the moment you were born, and the clock doesn't tick at a constant rate, it accelerates. That's Gompertz. That's the discovery. And it's been sitting there, confirmed, reconfirmed, tested against data from every country and every era we have reliable records for nearly 200 years. It works for Victorians. It works for Japanese centenarians. It works for Americans dying of heart disease. It works for populations with radically different diets, different medical systems, different stress levels, different genes. The specific numbers shift a little. The rate of doubling might be slightly faster here or slightly slower there, but the shape, the exponential doubling, that never changes. And almost nobody talks about it. Why? I'll tell you why. But first, I promised you an equation, and I always keep my promises. Let me show you the machine. Here it is. I'm going to tell, and I'm going to make you look at it, and I'm going to make sure you understand every single symbol before we move on, because the equation is simple enough that there's no excuse for looking away. The Gompertz law of human mortality is expressed as mu t equal to alpha it bt. That's it. That's the whole thing. 5 symbols and an exponential. Let me explain each piece. Mu t. This is the hazard rate, or what actuaries call the force of mortality. In plain English, it is the instantaneous probability of dying at age t. Not the probability of dying before age t. Not the probability of dying after the probability of dying right now, at this exact moment in your life. Think of it as a dial. At age 20, the dial reads one number. At age 40, the dial reads a higher number. At age 80, the dial is redlining. This function mu t tells you exactly what the dial reads at any age you plug in. Alpha, this is a constant. In practical terms, it represents your baseline mortality, the floor. The minimum hazard rate you start with, independent of age. This number varies between populations. It shifts based on sex, country of birth, era of history, access to medicine. But once you have it for a given population, it stays fixed. It's the starting point, where the dial is set when you're born. This is Euler's number, approximately 2.718. This is one of the most important numbers in mathematics. It is the base of the natural exponential function. And it appears here as it appears in compound interest, in radioactive decay, in population growth, in the spread of epidemics, because it is the mathematical fingerprint of doubling processes, of things that grow by feeding on themselves. And its presence here is not a coincidence. It is a clue, a massive flashing clue about why mortality works this way. But I'm saving that. Beta. This is the most important number in the equation. It is the rate at which your hazard rate increases. It is the knob that controls how fast the dial spins up as you age. For humans across most of the populations that have ever been studied, beta comes out to approximately 0.085 per year. Now, 0.085 doesn't sound like much. It sounds almost gentle. But let me show you what it means. The doubling time, the number of years it takes for your probability of dying to double, is calculated as doubling time equal to ln2 beta ln2 is approximately 0.693. Divide that by 0.085 and you get 8.15 years. Every 8 years, there it is again. Every 8 years, the dial doubles. Every 8 years, your hazard rate, your force of mortality, is twice what it was. You are, in a very precise mathematical sense, twice as mortal at 40 as you were at 32. Isn't that a strange thing to say? Twice as mortal? And yet it's perfectly precise. It has a number attached to it. You can calculate it for any age, for any population with known alpha and beta values, and you will be right. Not approximately right. Actuarially right, which for the purposes of predicting death is as close to certainly right as anything gets. Now there's a more complete version of the equation. Because Gompertz's original formulation was later extended by William Makem in 1860, who added a constant term to account for deaths that don't follow the exponential pattern: accidents, infectious diseases, random bad luck. The Gompertz-Makem law looks like this. Mu t equal to lambda plus alpha e at bt. where lambda, is the Maycomb term, a flat, age-independent rate of death. The risk of getting hit by a bus, of an infection that doesn't care how old you are, of a random misfortune that operates on everyone equally. In young people and people under about 40%, the Maycomb term lambda actually dominates. When you're young and the exponential alpha air, betat, is still small, most of your mortality risk comes from lambda, from accidents, from random catastrophe, from the universe's basic indifference to your survival. But as you age, the exponential term swallows the constant term. By 60, by 70, by 80, the alpha betat is so large that lambda barely registers. The exponential takes over completely. And at that point, you are almost entirely governed by the Gompertz curve. By the time you're very old, your fate is almost entirely described by 5 symbols and a rate of doubling. He picks up the chalk now, writes the equation on a board, or traces it in the air. Mu t equal to alpha eva at bt. Look at it. Really look at it. It's almost insultingly small for what it's describing. The single most universal biological law of human existence, the mathematical shape of how all of us die, fits on a napkin. But here's what I want you to feel. Standing here looking at this equation, I want you to feel 2 things simultaneously. The first thing is awe, the clean electric awe of recognizing something true. Because this equation is true. It describes reality. It is not a model, not an approximation, not a metaphor. When you plot actual death data for real human populations and you overlay this curve, the fit is extraordinary. The universe actually does this. Human bodies actually do obey this law, in the same way that planets obey Kepler's laws, in the same way that particles obey quantum mechanics. The second thing I want you to feel is dread. Not the vague philosophical dread of knowing you're mortal. Specific dread. The dread of knowing that this process, this exponential acceleration of your dying, has been running inside you since you were born. That right now, as you sit here, as you breathe, as you read these words, the dial is moving. Beta is doing its quiet work. Your hazard rate is, at this precise moment in time, measurably higher than it was 8 years ago, and measurably lower than it will be 8 years from now. That's not philosophy. That's not poetry. That is mathematics. Now let me tell you how it works. Because knowing the equation is one thing. Knowing why the equation is true, knowing what is actually happening inside your cells, your tissues, your molecular machinery, to produce this precise exponential shape, that is where this story goes from interesting to genuinely, profoundly disturbing. The first thing you need to understand is what the equation is actually measuring. When Gompertz found his law, he didn't know why it was true. He was a mathematician, not a biologist. The word biology barely existed in 1825, and the concept of cells, of DNA, of molecular machinery was decades away from even being imagined. He found the shape of mortality, but he had no idea what was making that shape. We know now. Not completely, science is never complete. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, but we know enough to tell a very specific story about why your hazard rate doubles every 8 years. The story starts in a place you can't see, can't feel, can't directly know anything about. It starts inside your cells. You have roughly 37 trillion cells in your body. 37 trillion. That number is so large that it doesn't mean anything to most people, so let me give it meaning. If you counted 1 cell per second, it would take you over 1 million years to count them all. Your body is not just a body, it is an ecosystem, a civilization, a humming, coordinated, almost incomprehensibly complex network of tiny machines, all cooperating, all communicating, all doing their specialized jobs to keep you alive. And every single one of those machines, every one of those 37 trillion cells, contains at its heart a copy of your genome, your DNA, the instruction manual. 3 billion base pairs of information, tightly wound, precisely organized, constantly read and reread by molecular machinery that operates with a fidelity that makes our best computers look sloppy. Now, that DNA is not static. It's not just sitting there. It's alive in the sense that it's constantly being copied. Every time a cell divides, the entire genome must be duplicated 3 billion base pairs, copied letter by letter, in a process that takes minutes. And the copying machinery is good. Remarkably good. The error rate is roughly 1 mistake per billion base pairs. In human terms, that's like typing out the entire text of 1,000 thick novels without making a single error. But here's the thing, and this is the thing that everything else depends on. It is not perfect, not quite. 1 in a billion is incredible. But 1 in a billion across 3 billion base pairs multiplied by trillions of cell divisions across a lifetime adds up. Mistakes accumulate, some are caught and repaired, many are repaired imperfectly, some slip through entirely. And slowly, over decades, the genome of your cells begins to drift from the original. Mutations accumulate, not dramatically, not suddenly, but steadily, quietly, exponentially. This is one mechanism. Let me give you 3 more because they all feed into the same story. Mechanism 2, telomere shortening. At the end of each of your chromosomes, like the plastic cap at the end of a shoelace, there is a structure called a telomere. It's made of repeating sequences of DNA that don't code for anything. They're not part of your genes. Their job is purely structural, to protect the ends of the chromosome during replication. But here's the problem. Every time a cell divides, the copying machinery can't quite reach the very end of the chromosome. A tiny bit of the telomere gets lost. The cap gets a little shorter, a little shorter, a little shorter. Across dozens, hundreds of cell divisions over a lifetime, the telomere erodes. When it erodes far enough, something critical happens. The cell recognizes that it's in danger, that the real genetic material might start being lost. So it does one of 2 things. It either stops dividing entirely, a state called cellular senescence, or it self-destructs via a process called apoptosis. Either way, you've lost a functional cell. Either way, the tissue it was part of becomes just slightly less efficient, slightly less resilient, slightly less capable of doing its job. And as this happens to more and more cells across more and more tissues across more and more years, the dial moves. Mechanism 3, mitochondrial decay. Inside each of your cells, tucked into the cytoplasm, are structures called mitochondria. They are, for all practical purposes, tiny power plants. They take in fuel, oxygen, glucose, and they produce ATP, which is the energy currency of the cell. Everything your cells do, every protein they make, every signal they send, every repair they carry out runs on ATP produced by mitochondria. Mitochondria are fascinating for many reasons, one of which is that they contain their own DNA, separate from the nuclear DNA in the cell's center. A remnant, it seems, of an ancient time when mitochondria were independent bacteria that got absorbed into larger cells and never left. But this separate DNA makes them vulnerable in a particular way. Nuclear DNA is protected. It's wrapped in histones, coiled into chromosomes, armored inside the nucleus, and surrounded by an elaborate repair machinery. Mitochondrial DNA has none of this. It sits exposed in the mitochondrial matrix, surrounded by the very oxygen radicals produced by the energy generation process itself. It gets damaged at a higher rate. It accumulates mutations faster. As mitochondria accumulate mutations, they become less efficient. They generate less ATP per unit of fuel. They start leaking reactive oxygen species, damaging molecules that harm the surrounding cell. A cell with damaged mitochondria is a cell running on a worn-out engine. It can still function, but not as well, not as reliably. And over decades, over 8-year intervals, the dial moves. Mechanism 4, epigenetic drift. This one is the strangest and in some ways the most interesting. Your DNA, the sequence of base pairs, is not the whole story of how your genes work. On top of the DNA is a layer of chemical marks. Methyl groups attached to specific bases, histone proteins with various modifications, a whole system of tags and labels that tells the cellular machinery which genes to read and which genes to ignore. This is called the epigenome, and it is almost as important as the genome itself. The epigenome is, in a meaningful sense, the interpretation layer of your genetics. 2 cells with the same DNA but different epigenetic marks will behave completely differently, which is why a liver cell and a brain cell can contain the same genome and yet do entirely different things. Now, the epigenome is not static either. It changes with experience. It changes with diet. It changes with age. And as you get older, the epigenetic marks on your cells drift in patterns that are so consistent that scientists have developed what they call epigenetic clocks, which can estimate your biological age and your remaining life expectancy from a blood sample with remarkable accuracy. These clocks work because the epigenetic changes track the Gompertz curve. The drift accelerates. The older you are, the faster the epigenome is changing away from its youthful state. It's as if the aging process has its own biological memory, its own internal calendar that keeps time by accumulating chemical changes at an exponentially increasing rate. Now, do you see what's happening? Look at these 4 mechanisms: mutation accumulation, telomere erosion, mitochondrial decay, epigenetic drift. They are all doing the same thing. They are all accumulating damage over time at an accelerating rate, not linearly, not randomly, at a rate that when you sum it all up, when you look at the aggregate effect on tissue function, on immune response, on cellular repair capacity, tracks the Gompertz curve almost exactly. The body is not simply wearing out in the way that a machine wears out. A machine wears out linearly. Parts degrade at a steady rate. But you are not degrading at a steady rate. You are degrading exponentially. Your systems are not just wearing out, they are becoming less and less able to repair themselves from wear. And that is the key. Here is the deepest mechanical story. When you are young, your repair mechanisms are robust. When a cell accumulates mutations, the immune system finds it and kills it. When a tissue is damaged, stem cells proliferate and replace the damaged cells. When a mitochondrion fails, the cell destroys it and generates a new one. The wear happens, but the repair keeps pace. Your net functional capacity stays high, but the repair mechanisms themselves age. The stem cells which do the replacing are running on telomeres that are also eroding. The immune cells which do the finding and killing are themselves running on mitochondria that are also decaying. The repair systems and the damage systems are both degrading, but because the repair systems are working on all the other systems, the degradation compounds. You are not a machine that wears out. You are a self-repairing machine whose repair capacity is itself subject to the same wear it is trying to prevent. And that kind of system, a self-referential, self-maintaining system with deteriorating maintenance, naturally generates an exponential degradation curve. The Gompertz equation is not some arbitrary statistical fit. It is the mathematical fingerprint of a self-maintaining system that is losing its ability to maintain itself. It is the shape of failure when the mechanism of failure is also failing. And here, right here, is where we leave the biology and go somewhere deeper. Because you've heard the equation now. You've heard the mechanisms. But I promised you more than that. I promised you the reason why this happens. Not the how, the why. And for that, we need to talk about something that will sound at first like a completely different subject. Bear with me. I want to tell you something about evolution, about natural selection, about what it actually means, not in the greeting card version where everything is progress and optimization and nature finding her way to perfection, but in the real version, the cold, mathematical, slightly horrifying version. Natural selection does not care about you. That sounds harsh. Let me be more precise. Natural selection does not operate on individuals. It operates on genes, or more precisely on the differential reproductive success of genetic variations within populations. The thing that gets selected, the thing that survives or doesn't survive across generations is not you. It's the probability that your genes will be present in future generations relative to alternative genes. Now, what does this mean for aging? It means the following. Natural selection has very strong opinions about what happens to you before and during your reproductive years. Every mutation that reduces your ability to survive childhood, to reach reproductive age, to successfully have children selection will see that mutation, and it will drag it out of the gene pool quickly and efficiently. Because genes that impair your reproduction don't make it to the next generation. That's almost definitionally true. But here is the critical thing, the thing that explains everything. Selection has very weak opinions about what happens to you after your reproductive years are complete. A mutation that kills you at 20 kills you before you can reproduce. Strong selection against it. A mutation that kills you at 30 is bad, but maybe you've already had children. Moderate selection against it. A mutation that kills you at 50, 70, 80, by then, in the ancestral environment in which our genomes evolved, you've probably already reproduced. Your children are grown. Your genes are in the next generation, regardless of whether you live or die. Selection barely sees you. You are, from the gene's point of view, spent. This was formalized in a theory called the mutation accumulation theory of aging, proposed by the British biologist Peter Medawar in 1952. His insight was devastating in its simplicity, because selection is weak at later ages. Harmful mutations that only express in later life don't get removed from the population. They accumulate. Over evolutionary time, they pile up because the selection pressure that would eliminate them is too weak to do the job. And this accumulation, this evolutionary garbage that builds up in the genome precisely because it doesn't hurt you until it's too late, from selection's perspective, though decidedly not from yours, is part of why aging happens at all. But there's more. There's a darker version. In 1957, the American biologist George Williams proposed something called antagonistic pleiotropy. It's a mouthful, so let me unpack it. Pleiotropy means that a single gene can have multiple effects on the organism. Williams asked, what if there are genes that are beneficial to you when you are young that improve your survival, your reproduction, your competitive fitness in the prime of your life, but harmful when you are old? If such genes exist, selection would actively promote them, because selection doesn't see the harm that happens after reproductive age is over. It only sees the benefit. And so genes that make you stronger at 25, at the cost of making you more likely to get cancer at 60, would be selected for. Evolution would actually put these genes into the population because the benefits come early and the costs come late. This is called antagonistic pleiotropy because the same genetic variant has antagonistic effects at different life stages. It's beneficial early, harmful late, and the mathematics of selection essentially guarantee that such genes will be favored whenever the early benefit outweighs the early life probability-weighted late life cost. Now do you see what's happening? The Gompertz curve, this exponential acceleration of your dying, is not an accident. It is not an engineering failure. It is not a bug in the system that could be fixed with a better design. It is the output of evolutionary optimization. We are dying at an exponentially accelerating rate because evolution never had a good reason to prevent it, because selection is blind to the suffering of the old, because the genetic machinery that gave us our best years carries, stitched into it, the seeds of the decay that follows. Because we are, each of us, the descendant of an unbroken line of organisms that reproduced before they could be harmed by their own aging, and so the genes that caused the aging were never weeded out, and in many cases were actively promoted. You are not dying despite your genome's best efforts. You are dying in part because of your genome, because the same genes that made you a good primate, strong, reproductively capable, immune to certain childhood diseases, are the genes that are now slowly, exponentially dismantling you. This is the reason nobody talks about it. It's not that the equation is obscure. It's not that the mathematics is hard. It's that the story the equation tells, the deep story, the evolutionary story, is deeply, profoundly uncomfortable, in a way that's different from ordinary mortality anxiety. Ordinary mortality anxiety says, I will die someday. That's sad, poignant, manageable. What the Gompertz equation says is, you are already in the middle of your dying. You have been dying at an accelerating rate since your early 20s. The process is not waiting for you. It is happening right now, exponentially, with mathematical precision, because the universe that made you did not make you to last. That is not a comfortable story. But I think you need to hear it, because I think people who understand this, who really understand it, in the bones live differently, not fearfully, not desperately, but with a clarity about time that most people spend their whole lives avoiding. Here's where I want to be careful with you, because I don't want to give you the wrong impression. The Gompertz equation is a population-level law. It describes the average behavior of large groups of humans across time. It is statistical truth, not individual truth. And there is a difference, a very important difference that I want to make sure you feel. When I say your probability of dying doubles every 8 years, I'm talking about a population average. For the population of 40-year-olds, the hazard rate is roughly double what it was for 32-year-olds. But you specifically, the individual sitting here with your specific genes, your specific habits, your specific history of illness and luck and circumstance, you are not the population average. Some people's alpha and beta values are different from the average. Some people have slower clocks. Some have faster ones. Some people have genes that express the antagonistic pleiotropy strongly. They pay a heavy later life price for early life advantages. Some have cleaner genetic histories. Some have repaired themselves aggressively throughout life, whether through exercise or diet or fortunate genetics, and their biological age is years behind their chronological age. The Gompertz equation doesn't know which one you are. And that uncertainty is, to my mind, the most important thing about it. Because here's the thing, we can now measure individual biological aging rates. The epigenetic clocks I mentioned earlier, tools like the Horvath clock, the Grimmage clock, the Dundon Pace clock can take a blood sample and tell you with considerable accuracy whether your biological aging is running ahead of your chronological age or behind it. This is extraordinary. This is in some sense the fulfillment of what Gompertz started, not just measuring the population curve, but measuring where on that curve an individual sits. And the results are both frightening and hopeful. Frightening because some people's biological clocks are running 15, 20 years ahead of their birthdays. Their cells have accumulated the epigenetic marks of a 60-year-old while they're still chronologically 45. Their dial is further along than they think. Hopeful because others are running significantly behind. Their cells are younger than their chronological age. Their telomeres are longer, their mitochondria are cleaner, their epigenetic marks are more youthful, and the factors that appear to contribute to this are not mysterious. Exercise, particularly vigorous aerobic and resistance exercise, caloric moderation without malnutrition, sleep quality, stress management, social connection, not exotic interventions, not expensive therapies, the same things that every grandmother ever has told you to do. It turns out your grandmother was doing anti-Gompertz research without knowing it. But here's what I find most thrilling, and I mean thrilling in the scientific sense, the sense of standing at the edge of something vast, is that we are now starting to understand aging not merely as a law to be observed, but potentially as a process to be modified. Because if the Gompertz curve is the output of specific biological mechanism, mutation accumulation, telomere erosion, mitochondrial decay, epigenetic drift, then in principle, if you could intervene in those mechanisms, you could change the shape of the curve, you could change beta, you could make the doubling time longer, you could make alpha smaller, you could in mathematical terms shift the entire curve to the right, buying more years before the exponential takes over. This is not science fiction, this is ongoing science. The drug rapamycin in mouse models has extended median lifespan by something between 15 and 25% by interfering with a cellular pathway called mTOR that sits at the intersection of nutrient sensing, autophagy, and aging. Senolytics, drugs that selectively eliminate senescent cells, the ones that have stopped dividing but are pumping out inflammatory signals, have shown remarkable results in extending health span in animal models. NAD+ precursors have shown some promise in restoring mitochondrial function. Gene therapies targeting telomere extension are in early clinical trials. We do not yet know how much of this will translate to humans. Biology is humbling. Every time we think we've found the master switch, we discover that the system is more complicated than we thought, more redundant, more interdependent. But the direction is clear. The Gompertz curve, for the first time in the 200 years since Gompertz first traced its shape, is starting to look like something that might be negotiable, not repealed, not abolished. The thermodynamics of entropy are real. The law of increasing disorder applies to biological systems as surely as to anything else. You will still age, you will still die, but the rate, the beta, the relentless doubling every 8 years, that might be something we can argue with. I want to talk about what it means to actually know this, to carry this equation around in your head. Because I've been talking about mortality mathematically for a long time now, and I want to make sure I give you something true and useful to take away from it, rather than just an elegant terror. The Gompertz equation, properly understood, is a clock. It is telling you something precise about where you are in time, about the rate at which your time is passing. And one of the most important things I can tell you from my own experience of thinking about hard truths is that knowing the rate of change changes how you value the thing that's changing. Imagine two people. Both are 40 years old. Both have statistically maybe 40 more years of life. But one of them knows about the Gompertz curve. One of them knows that their hazard rate has been doubling. That right now at 40 they are roughly 4 times as likely to die in the next year as they were at 24. That in 8 years they will be 8 times as likely. That the exponential is running relentlessly in their body. Does that person live the same life as the person who hasn't thought about this? I don't think so. I don't think I live the same life for thinking about it. Because here's what the Gompertz equation tells you, if you're willing to listen carefully. It tells you that time is not uniform, that a year at 30 is not the same as a year at 70. Not because the calendar year is different, but because your relationship to risk, to mortality, to the fragility of your continued existence, is exponentially different. The year at 30 happens in a body where the dial is at 1 setting. The year at 70 happens in a body where the dial is at 8 times that setting. The lived quality of time, the background radiation of mortality that hums beneath everything you do is different. And knowing this should make you value the earlier years differently, not with dread, with appreciation. with a kind of urgent, clear-eyed gratitude for what is still, at the present moment, a low-hazard stretch of your existence. This is the Stoic insight, arrived at through mathematics. The Stoics talked about memento mori, remember that you die, not as a morbid practice, but as a clarity-generating one. If you remember that you die, you appreciate what you have. You don't waste today on resentments that won't matter. You don't defer the important thing until a tomorrow that might not come the way you expect. The Gompertz equation is memento mori with numbers attached. It's not just reminding you that you die, it's telling you that you are dying at a specific, measurable, accelerating rate, and that the dial has been moving since you were in your 20s, and that every 8 years the situation is quantitatively twice as serious. Is that terrifying? Yes, a little. I won't lie to you, I never lie, it takes too much memory. It is a little bit terrifying. But terror is not the point. The point is precision. The point is that vague awareness of mortality produces vague responses. It produces procrastination, denial, the gentle fog of someday I'll get around to the important things. Precise awareness of mortality produces clarity. It produces the specific, urgent understanding that the exponential is running, that the doubling times are real, and that today, right now, at whatever age you happen to be reading these words, the dial is at the lowest setting it will ever be for the rest of your life. Today is the lowest hazard day you have left. That is not a depressing thought. That is the most motivating thing I know how to say. Let me zoom out for a moment. Let me go wide, because I think the Gompertz equation connects to something even larger, something that is, to me at least, one of the deepest puzzles in biology. The equation is universal within our species. It describes humans with a remarkable consistency across time and geography. But what about other species? Here's where it gets spectacularly interesting. The Gompertz law holds for many, many species, but the parameters vary wildly. The beta value, the rate of doubling, is different for different animals, and that difference correlates with something fascinating. Mice have a very high beta, their hazard rate doubles rapidly. They age fast. A mouse at 2 years old is in Gompertz terms extremely old. A mouse at 3 years is ancient. Elephants have a much lower beta, their hazard rate doubles much more slowly. They live proportionally much longer lives, longer relative to their body size, their metabolic rate, their biological complexity. Bowhead whales, the extraordinary animals of the Arctic which can live over 200 years, have an almost impossibly low beta. Their mortality curve is nearly flat, well into what we would consider extreme old age. Their clock runs very slowly. Naked mole rats, small, ugly, fascinating creatures that live underground in colonial structures in East Africa, have a beta that is statistically nearly zero. They appear to violate the Gompertz law entirely. Their hazard rate doesn't increase with age. A 20-year-old naked mole rat has roughly the same probability of dying in the next year as a 2-year-old naked mole rat. They do not age, not in the Gompertz sense, not in any measurable biological sense that we currently understand. Why? That question is one of the hottest areas in biology right now. What is the naked mole rat doing or not doing that the rest of us aren't? Their cancer rate is essentially zero. Their telomeres barely shorten. Their mitochondria are unusually resistant to oxidative damage. Their epigenetic clocks run at nearly flat rates. Whatever antagonistic pleiotropic genes the rest of us are carrying, they either don't have them or have found a way to suppress them. And the tantalizing implication is this. If it is biologically possible to have a near-zero beta, if evolution has in at least one lineage stumbled upon a way to largely decouple biological function from age, then there is no fundamental physical law that makes the Gompertz curve inevitable. The laws of thermodynamics apply to naked mole rats too. Their cells accumulate damage, their DNA gets hit by cosmic rays and metabolic byproducts like everyone else's, and yet the curve stays flat. The answer, best as we can currently tell, has to do with maintenance, with how aggressively the mole rat's cellular machinery repairs damage, with how efficiently it runs quality control on its proteins, its mitochondria, its DNA. The repair mechanisms in naked mole rats are, apparently, running at a level of effectiveness that simply doesn't allow the exponential accumulation to get started. Which means the Gompertz curve is not a law like gravity, universal, inescapable, beyond any conceivable intervention. It is a law like the speed of a car, real, measurable, but subject to adjustment depending on the engine, the fuel, and how well you maintain the machine. The naked mole rat has a better engine, or at least it has better mechanics, and now in the 21st century, for the first time, we are starting to learn how to be our own mechanics. I have to be straight with you now, because I've been building a case, and it's a true case, but it's not the whole case. The whole case requires me to tell you what we don't know, because the things we don't know are as important as the things we do. We don't know if the aging interventions that work in mice will work in humans. Rapamycin, caloric restriction, senolytics in mice, these show dramatic, consistent results. In humans, the evidence is much more mixed. We are not mice. We are much more complex. Our repair systems are already more robust. Our aging timelines are longer. The interventions that nudge a mouse's lifespan by 25% might nudge a human's lifespan by 5%, or 2%, or nothing detectable against the noise of individual variation. We don't know why some people have low beta values. We can measure it now. The epigenetic clocks give us real data, but the causes of individual variation in aging rate are still only partially understood. Genetics plays a role, but a smaller role than you might expect. Studies of identical twins show that only about 25% of the variation in lifespan is heritable. The rest is lifestyle, environment, and what scientists politely call stochastic factors, which is a technical way of saying luck. We don't know if the Gompertz curve extends smoothly to the very old ages. There is real scientific debate about what happens at extreme ages above 105, above 110. Some researchers see hints that the hazard rate slows down or even plateaus at the very highest ages. This is called the late life mortality deceleration. If it's real, it would mean that the people who survive to extreme age, the true supercentenarians, have somehow beaten the Gompertz acceleration. Are they outliers? Did they have genuinely lower beta values from birth? Or does the hazard rate reach some maximum level and simply stop accelerating? We don't know. We don't know if there is a maximum human lifespan. This question is genuinely controversial among serious scientists. Some say the data strongly support a hard biological ceiling somewhere around 125 years. Others argue that the observed maximum lifespan has been creeping upward as medicine improves and that it's a ceiling only in the sense that we haven't yet found a way through it. The Gompertz equation by itself doesn't predict a maximum, it predicts only a rate of change. A sufficiently extended tail of the distribution could, in principle, allow for arbitrarily old ages, even under Gompertz dynamics. I find the uncertainty thrilling. This is the thing I always say that people never quite believe. The most interesting position is not knowing. The things we understand completely are boring. The frontier, the place where our equations break down, where the data gets noisy, where the honest answer is we genuinely don't know yet, that is where the real excitement lives. The Gompertz equation is not the final word on human mortality. It is the first rigorous word, the first time someone stared at the darkness and found a pattern in it. And in the nearly 2 centuries since Gompertz sat at that foggy London desk and first traced the exponential curve, we've learned the mechanisms behind it, the evolutionary reasons for it, and we've begun very tentatively, very carefully, with many caveats and much uncertainty, to think about how to argue with it. That is not a small thing. That is potentially one of the most important ongoing stories in the history of biology. I want to talk to you directly for a moment, person to person. No equations, no evolutionary theory, just a conversation about what it means to carry this knowledge. I've spent a lot of my life thinking about what the universe is made of. Electrons and photons and the strange behavior of particles at the quantum scale. I've found enormous joy in those questions. But the Gompertz equation is different from the equations of physics, in a way that I think matters. The equations of physics describe things that are happening out there in the external world. The Gompertz equation describes something happening in here, in your body, in mine. It describes not just an abstract population, but you specifically, your specific biological machinery, running its specific clock, ticking its specific exponential. That makes it personal in a way that, say, quantum electrodynamics is not. And being personal, it demands a personal response. My response, the response I've arrived at after thinking about this for a long time, is not dread. It's not resignation. It's not the grim stoicism of the man who stares at the graph and says, well, the numbers are what they are. My response is curiosity, combined with urgency, combined with a certain clarity about what matters, because here's what the Gompertz equation actually shows you when you look at it calmly. It shows you that you have time, not infinite time, not the same time at every age, but time. Right now, at whatever age you are, your hazard rate is lower than it will ever be again. This is the minimum risk moment of your remaining life. The exponential has been running, yes, the dial has been moving, but you are here, you are reading this. The process has not finished. And the only question really that matters is, what do you do with the time you have, knowing what you now know about its nature? I don't have a formula for that. I wish I did, it would be tidier. But I think the honest answer is that you have to work it out for yourself. The mathematics can tell you the rate of change. It cannot tell you the direction. It cannot tell you what to change toward. That is your work. That is the part that doesn't fit in an equation. What I can tell you is that the people I've known who seem most fully alive, most engaged, most present in their lives were, in my observation, people who had somehow internalized the exponentiality of time, who understood, without necessarily knowing the mathematics, that each year was not the same as the last, that the appropriate response to limited accelerating time was not paralysis or despair but attention. sharpened, focused, grateful attention to what is actually here, actually happening, actually mattering. The Gompertz equation is, in that sense, a gift, a strange gift. The kind of gift that arrives wrapped in something uncomfortable, that you have to unwrap slowly and carefully, and that takes some time to appreciate. But a gift, it says, here is the truth about your time, not comfortable, not soothing, but true. And true things, precisely because they are true, can be used. Why no one talks about this? I said at the beginning that nobody talks about this. I said the equation has been sitting there for 200 years, confirmed and reconfirmed, hiding in actuarial tables and insurance spreadsheets, and nobody talks about it. Let me now make good on that claim. Why? Part of it is obvious, it is uncomfortable. Mortality is uncomfortable. Exponential mortality with measurable doubling times is very uncomfortable. There's no mystery about why someone might prefer not to dwell on the precise mathematical shape of their own death curve. But I think there's something more than simple discomfort. I think there's a specific kind of threat that the Gompertz equation poses, a threat to a story we tell ourselves that turns out to be very important to how we function. The story is this: I am in control of my health. We are flooded, in modern culture, with information about how to be healthy, what to eat, how to exercise, what supplements to take, what habits to cultivate. And this is good information. Many of these things genuinely matter, genuinely do shift your position on the Gompertz curve. But wrapped around this good information is a larger message that health is largely a matter of choices, that if you do the right things you will be fine, that disease and death are primarily the consequences of decisions, of lifestyle, of individual agency. The Gompertz equation messes with this story. Because the Gompertz equation says that even if you do everything right, even if you exercise, sleep, eat well, don't smoke, manage stress, the dial is still moving. The exponential is still running, the doubling is still happening. In every cell of your body, regardless of your virtue, you can shift the curve, you can change alpha, you can perhaps nudge beta, but you cannot stop the process, you cannot opt out of the exponential. That's threatening to the control narrative. It introduces a mandatory, irreducible element of powerlessness, and we don't like powerlessness. We find it intolerable, so we prefer collectively not to look directly at the curve. We prefer the vague awareness of mortality, yes, I'll die someday, to the precise awareness of the rate at which we are currently becoming more mortal. And the insurance companies and the actuaries know the equation. They price it into every life insurance premium. They base their entire business model on the Gompertz curve. They are doing, every day, millions of calculations based on the precise exponential shape of human mortality. They just don't tell you that's what they're doing. There's something ironic about that. The most precise mathematical description of your death is used primarily to calculate how much money to charge you for protection against it. The equation that could change how you live your life is used instead to set your insurance premium. Seems like a waste of a good equation. What you do with a death equation? Let me bring this home. You've heard the equation. Mim t equals sine alpha e biped beta. You've heard the mechanisms, the mutations, the telomeres, the mitochondria, the epigenetic drift. You've heard the evolutionary story, why aging exists at all, why it takes the shape it takes, why the universe that made you built in the very mechanism of your unmaking. You've heard what we don't know, and why the uncertainty is as important as the knowledge. What do you do with all of this? I have a few thoughts. Not prescriptions. I distrust prescriptions. Thoughts. First, respect the exponential. Don't abstract it. Don't let it become a vague philosophical concept. The doubling is real. It is happening in your cells right now. And respecting it means taking seriously what happens to you at each stage of your life, not morbidly, not obsessively, but clearly. If you are 40, your hazard rate is roughly twice what it was at 32. That is not just a fact, that is information. What information does your 40-year-old hazard rate give you about how to spend your time? What things that you've been deferring are now a little more urgent than they were at 32? Second, look at the mechanisms. The four biological mechanisms I described, mutation accumulation, telomere erosion, mitochondrial decay, epigenetic drift, are all to some meaningful degree modifiable. Exercise doesn't just make you feel good. It measurably slows epigenetic aging as measured by the most rigorous biological clocks available. It preserves telomere length. It stimulates mitophagy, the cellular housekeeping process that removes damaged mitochondria. It reduces the accumulation of senescent cells. The same things that humans have always known to be good for you are the things that biologically push back on the mechanisms that drive the Gompertz curve. This is not magic. This is not wishful thinking. This is the specific mechanism-level reason why exercise extends healthy lifespan. It's not that movement is generally good. It's that movement specifically addresses the biological processes that produce the exponential degradation. Exercise is in a very real sense anti-Gompertz. Third, pay attention to your biological age, not just your chronological age. We are now in a world where this is measurable. There are consumer blood tests that will estimate your biological age via epigenetic clocks. They are not perfect, they are not destiny. But they give you information. They tell you whether your dial is ahead of or behind your birthday. And information, even uncomfortable information, is always better than ignorance. Fourth, hold your uncertainty. The equation describes populations, not individuals. Your personal beta is not precisely known. Your individual trajectory is not determined. The person who takes the Gompertz equation as a guarantee of their personal death date has misunderstood what it means. It is a law of averages. Real human lives deviate from averages in both directions, for reasons both known and unknown. You might be above the curve, you might be below it. You are not the curve, you are an individual, navigating the terrain described by the curve. Hold that distinction carefully. Fifth and last, don't make peace with it too quickly. I mean that sincerely. The temptation, when you encounter a mathematical law as robust and well confirmed as the Gompertz equation, is to say, well, that's just how it is. It's a law. Accept it. Make your peace. And there's a place for acceptance. There's a place for the kind of equanimity that comes from looking clearly at a hard truth. But acceptance and resignation are not the same thing. The Gompertz equation is a description of how biology has worked given the evolutionary history we happen to have had and the repair mechanisms we happen to have developed. It is not a proof that this is how biology must work. The naked mole rat did not accept the curve. It found a different parameter space, and we strange tool-making, equation-writing, curiosity-driven primates who have been systematically dismantling the limits of what's biologically possible for the last 100 years. We are in the early stages of figuring out how to argue with our own beta. Don't make peace with it too quickly. Keep a little fire. Keep a little refusal. Not the panicked refusal of someone who can't accept mortality. That's a different thing, and it doesn't lead anywhere useful. The investigative refusal, the Feynman kind, the kind that says, yes, this is how it works, and I find that fascinating, and I also want to know how it could work differently. And I'm going to keep pulling on that thread until I've understood it as deeply as it can be understood. Because understanding, real deep mathematical understanding, is always the first step to changing a thing. Benjamin Gompertz, 1825, foggy London, a desk covered in mortality tables, a man looking for a shape. He found it. A curve that rises slowly at first, then faster still, doubling every 8 years, inexorable, precise, universal. He wrote it down in 5 symbols and an exponential. He did not know when he wrote it down what it meant. He knew it described mortality. He didn't know it was tracing the shadow of evolution's indifference to the old. He didn't know it was encoding the consequences of telomere erosion and mitochondrial decay. He didn't know it would one day be measured against epigenetic clocks and found to be accurate to within the error bars of our best biological instruments. He couldn't know any of that. He just saw the shape, and he wrote it down, and in writing it down, he gave us something that every single person alive has been carrying their whole lives without knowing it. You have a hazard rate. Right now, at this age, at this moment, it is a specific number, small if you're young, larger if you're older, climbing with a doubling time of about 8 years. It is real, it is in your cells, it is the mathematical shadow of 2 billion years of evolution, the fossil record of every reproductive decision your ancestors ever made, the accumulated price of every gene that helped them survive to procreate. And you've been carrying it your whole life. I think there's something remarkable about that. About the fact that the mathematics of your own mortality was written down in 1825 and has been confirmed and reconfirmed for 200 years. And that most people go their entire lives never knowing the equation that describes the rate at which they are dying. There's something almost comic about it, in the dark, absurdist way that the universe is sometimes comic. But I also think, and this is my closing thought, the thing I most want you to take away, that knowing the equation doesn't change the equation. The dial is moving whether you know about it or not. The doubling is happening whether you've heard of Gompertz or not. What knowing changes is you, what you do with the time, what you pay attention to, what you decide is actually worth your finite, exponentially becoming more finite days. The universe doesn't give us many equations this honest. Most of what we know about the world is complicated, uncertain, contested, provisional. But this one, this quiet, 5-symbol, 200-year-old equation hiding in actuarial tables, is as close to an honest, straightforward description of human biological reality as we've got. Mu petit equals sign alpha e Boitman beta t. Your hazard rate at time t equals a baseline rate multiplied by e raised to the power of your age times the Gompertz constant. Beautiful, useful, terrifying. Now what are you going to do with the rest of your t?